I stood there, paralyzed, watching a 7-year-old boy crunch down on a jagged piece of granite, as if it were a potato chip. And the sound of his teeth grinding against the stone still haunts my dreams every single night. You think you've seen everything as an educator, but when I saw the blood trickling from his gums while he smiled and asked for more minerals, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a picky eater. I was looking at a dark, twisted secret that his parents had been hiding behind their perfect suburban picket fence. Was I wrong to risk my entire career to break into their home and find out what they were really feeding him? Or would you have stood by and watched a child literally turn his insides into a quarry? Please, I need you to listen to this story and tell me if my obsession saved his life or if I'm the villain for tearing a family apart. It all started on a Tuesday, just 3 weeks into the new semester at Oak Ridge Elementary. I've been teaching 2nd grade for nearly a decade, and you get used to the weird things kids bring in their lunchboxes: cold pizza, soggy nuggets, even the occasional bag of raw onions. But Toby was different. Toby was a quiet, pale boy who never caused trouble, never spoke unless spoken to, and always sat at the very back of the cafeteria. He was the kind of kid who blurs into the background until you realize he's been staring at you for 5 minutes without blinking. On this particular day, the cafeteria was a chaotic mess of screaming kids and spilled milk, but Toby was sitting in total silence, hunched over a plain metal lunchbox. I walked over to check on him because he hadn't touched his juice box, and as I leaned in, I heard it, a rhythmic, sickening crunch-crack sound. It wasn't the sound of a carrot or a cracker. It was the sound of something dense and unforgiving being pulverized. When I asked him what he was eating, he didn't hide it. He opened his hand to reveal 3 smooth, gray river stones and a sharp piece of decorative quartz. He looked me dead in the eyes, his chin dusted with gray powder, and told me that his belly needed the weight, because the soft food made him feel like he was floating away. I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. I immediately took the stones away and escorted him to the nurse, but when I called his parents, I didn't get the reaction I expected. His mother, a woman named Elena who always looked like she stepped out of a high-end fashion magazine, didn't sound worried. She sounded annoyed. She told me Toby had a calcium deficiency, and that he was just playing pretend with some garden rocks. She laughed it off, but her laugh was dry and brittle, like the very stones I had just confiscated. The following days were a blur of anxiety. I began to notice Toby's physical state deteriorating rapidly. His skin wasn't just pale. It was becoming translucent, revealing dark, heavy veins that seemed to throb with a sluggish rhythm. He moved with a strange stiffness, as if his joints were being seized by invisible rust. Every time I looked at him, I felt a cold chill. I started finding rocks everywhere. They were tucked into his shoes, sewn into the hem of his jacket, and once, I even found a small pile of pebbles hidden inside his hollowed-out glue stick. I attempted to talk to the school counselor, Mrs. Gable, but she was more concerned with parental autonomy than the actual physical welfare of the student. She told me that unless there were bruises or clear signs of physical battery, my hands were tied. People have different ways of raising their kids, Sarah, she had told me with a patronizing pat on the shoulder. We can't go around accusing successful people like the Millers of abuse just because their kid has a weird habit. But it wasn't a habit. It was a compulsion, or worse, a command. I decided to spend my lunch breaks researching Silas and Elena Miller. On the surface, they were local icons. Silas ran a high-end architecture firm, and Elena was a prominent socialite. But as I dug deeper into the dark corners of the internet, the forums where alternative health turned into something much more sinister, I found Silas's name mentioned in a private group called the Lithos Circle. The circle wasn't just about rocks. It was about a philosophy they called petrification of the soul. They believed that modern society had made humans gaseous and weak, and that by consuming the literal foundation of the earth, one could achieve a state of permanent physical and spiritual stability. They posted photos of mineral-enriched meals that looked like buckets of gravel mixed with gray sludge. There were testimonials from people claiming they no longer felt pain because their nerves were being protected by the crust. I realized with a jolt of horror that Toby wasn't just a child to them. He was an experimental vessel. He was being used to test how much of the earth a human body could absorb before it stopped being human. I stayed up until 4 a.m. reading their manifestos, my stomach turning with every page. They spoke about the weight as a divine gift. They claimed that the heavier the body, the more grounded the spirit. It was a cult, plain and simple, and Toby was their youngest, most vulnerable convert. I knew I couldn't go back to the principal. I knew I couldn't trust the school board. They were all donors to Silas's firm or friends with Elena. I was completely alone in this. By the second week, Toby started coughing. It wasn't a normal cough. It sounded like two bricks being rubbed together. When he spat into a tissue, I saw flecks of gray silt and bright red blood. I cornered him in the library during recess. "Toby, you have to tell me the truth," I whispered, kneeling so I was at eye level with him. "What are they giving you at home? What are you eating for dinner?" He looked around nervously, his eyes darting to the security cameras. "Mommy says the soft food makes the demons fly inside us," he whispered so softly I could barely hear him. "Daddy says if I get heavy enough, the demons can't lift me. I have to be a mountain, Miss Sarah. Mountains don't feel pain." The sheer psychological grooming it took to convince a child of that was staggering. I felt a surge of rage so powerful it made my vision blur. These people were destroying his childhood, his body, and his mind for a delusional fantasy. That afternoon, when Silas came to pick him up, I stood by the gate and watched. Silas didn't hug him. He didn't ask how his day was. He simply gripped Toby's shoulder with a hand that looked like it was made of iron, and led him to the car. Toby walked with a heavy, dragging gait, his backpack bulging with what I knew were more stones. So that's the situation I was in. I had a school board telling me to shut up, a doctor's note that looked forged, and a little boy whose body was literally filling up with stones because his parents were obsessed with a cult-like diet. I had to make a choice. Do I follow the rules and stay out of it, or do I go to their house and find the evidence the police said they didn't have? Before I tell you about the night I climbed through their basement window, and what I found in their kitchen, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have called Child Protective Services for the 10th time and hoped for the best? Or would you have taken matters into your own hands like I did? I need to know if you think I'm crazy for what I did next. I decided that waiting for the system was a death sentence for Toby. That Friday, I called in sick and spent the day preparing. I bought a high-powered flashlight, a small digital recorder, and a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. I knew the Miller estate was guarded by a gate, but the back of the property bordered a public hiking trail with only a thin wire fence for privacy. I waited until the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over the woods. My heart was pounding like a drum in my chest as I parked my car 3 miles away and hiked through the brush. The house was a monstrosity of modern architecture, all glass and sharp angles, looking like a fortress of stone and steel. I watched from the tree line as the lights in the main house flickered off one by one. I waited for 2 more hours, shivering in the damp night air, until the only light remaining was a dim, sickly green glow coming from the basement windows. I crept forward, every twig snap sounding like a gunshot in the silence. I found a small ventilation window, near the foundation that was slightly ajar. I squeezed through, scraping my back against the concrete, and dropped into the darkness. The air in the basement was thick and tasted like wet copper. As I shined my light around, I saw that this wasn't a normal basement. It was a workshop. There were industrial-sized stone crushers, vats of gray liquid, and shelves lined with jars labeled with geological terms. Basalt grade A, crushed obsidian, sediment slurry. It looked like a pharmacy for a mountain. I moved deeper into the room and found a series of notebooks. I opened one and saw Toby's name at the top of every page. It was a log. Day 412. Subject consumed 400 g of granite dust. Heart rate slowed. Density increasing. Subject complained of internal friction. Increased lubricant intake. The lubricant was a bottle of heavy mineral oil sitting on the bench. They were treating their son like a machine that needed oiling. I felt like I was going to vomit. I took photos of every single page, my hands shaking so hard I had to lean against a cold stone pillar to steady myself. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps directly above me. I froze, holding my breath until my lungs burned. The footsteps stopped right above the basement stairs. The door creaked open. I dove behind a stack of crates filled with raw or just as the basement lights hummed to life. It was Silas. He wasn't the polished professional I saw at school. He was wearing a heavy leather apron, and his skin looked sallow and waxy under the fluorescent lights. He walked over to the stone crusher and turned it on. The roar was deafening in the small space. He began dumping large chunks of gray rock into the machine, watching with a disturbing intensity as they were pulverized into a fine, choking powder. He took a scoop of the dust and tasted it, nodding to himself with a grim satisfaction. "Almost ready, Toby," he muttered to himself over the din of the machine. "Almost solid." He then walked over to a small, heavy door in the corner of the basement, one I hadn't noticed before. He unlocked it with a heavy key and stepped inside. I waited, my heart hammering, and then I heard Toby's voice. It was weak, thin, and filled with a terror that broke my heart. "Please, Daddy, no more. It hurts. My tummy is full." Silas's voice was cold, devoid of any parental warmth. "The pain is just the air leaving your body, Toby. You have to be strong. You have to be heavy. Eat." I knew I had to get out and get the police immediately, but as I turned to crawl back toward the window, I saw something that stopped me dead. On a separate workbench sat a row of smaller jars, all labeled with the names of other children in my class. These people weren't just feeding Toby, they were planning to expand. They were identifying other light children in the community to recruit or abduct into their solidification process. I realized the scope of the horror was far greater than I imagined. I reached for my phone to record the conversation in the other room, but in my panic, I knocked over a small jar of pebbles. The sound was tiny, but in the silence between the crusher's cycles, it sounded like a landslide. Silas went silent. I heard him step out of the small room. "Who's there?" he barked. I didn't wait. I scrambled toward the window, throwing decorum to the wind. I heard him running toward me, his heavy boots thudding on the concrete. I lunged through the window, the jagged glass catching my arm, and tumbled into the dirt outside. I didn't look back. I ran through the woods, thorns tearing at my skin, until I reached my car. I drove like a maniac to the nearest police station, covered in blood, dust, and tears. The police raid was a whirlwind of blue and red lights. Because I had the photos of the logs and the recording of Silas forcing Toby to eat, they didn't need a warrant to enter under exigent circumstances. They found Toby locked in that small, windowless room, lying on a bed made of literal stone. He was barely conscious. The paramedics had to be careful moving him because his internal organs were so heavily impacted by the minerals that any sudden movement could have caused a rupture. Silas and Elena were tackled to the ground in their silk pajamas, screaming about the awakening, and the airy sheep, who were trying to steal their son's density. It was the most disturbing thing I have ever witnessed. They were completely disconnected from reality, lost in a shared psychosis that had nearly cost a child his life. The detectives later told me that when they searched the rest of the house, they found a tomb in the backyard. A beautifully carved stone sarcophagus they were preparing for Toby once he reached his final form. Toby was rushed into a 12-hour emergency surgery. The surgeons removed nearly 6 pounds of various minerals, glass, and sand from his digestive system. It was a medical miracle he survived. The recovery was grueling. He had to be on a specialized liquid diet for months, and the psychological trauma required years of intensive therapy. But he survived. He's with a family now that understands that love isn't about making a child heavy or solid, but about letting them be light enough to run and play. As for me, the school board did exactly what I expected. They fired me for criminal trespassing and endangering the school's reputation. They tried to sweep the whole thing under the rug, but the story leaked. The rock-eating cult became national news. I became a pariah in my hometown, but a hero to people who actually care about children. I moved away, changed my name, and started a new life, but I still check the news every day to make sure those monsters stay behind bars. Looking back, the signs were all there from the very first day, and it makes me wonder how many other strange kids are sitting in classrooms right now, crying out for help in ways we've been trained to ignore. We are taught to be polite, to respect privacy, and to never interfere with a family's culture. But some things are universal. Pain is universal. Abuse is universal. And the duty to protect a child is more important than any job, any reputation, or any law. I lost my career, but I saved a soul. I would do it again in a heartbeat, even if it meant losing everything all over again. I've learned that the most dangerous things in this world aren't the monsters under the bed, but the people who think they are saving you while they are actually burying you alive. Like this video if you were on my side and think I did the right thing by breaking into that house. Subscribe for more stories like this where the truth is more shocking than any horror movie, and please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Was Silas a victim of his own madness? Or was he just a monster looking for an excuse? Do you think the school should have protected me instead of firing me? Your support helps me keep telling these stories and bringing these dark secrets to light. I'll see you all in the next story.